all of you do in some ways some kind of transformational work, some ways of changing people, shifting where they are. And I've done this sort of thing for a long time myself, and actually really hit it very young. I mean, when I grew up, I was in a religious community where there were stories of, spiritual figures healing people and so on and so forth. And there was something about it that just resonated for me. And it was like, yeah, that's the way things are, and that's right. And when I was about 6 years old, I asked somebody in the community how old I would have to be before they would start teaching me how to heal people. And of course they said, oh, well, we don't do that anymore. Now you go to medical school. And when they said that to me, I was like, oh, that's just so wrong. I kind of looking at this adult and going, wow, you don't even know that. Well, you're an adult and you don't know that. And of course, in our contemporary frame, it would just be that I was involved in magical thinking and I never got over it. And that's kind of the challenge of transformational work, is the frame that it's magical thinking that people haven't gotten over. And because I resonated with so deeply and have spent a long time finding my way towards the language, reasons for developing this class, because it's a persistent problem in Western culture. Now, there are people that we can all talk to that go, oh yeah, I get it, oh so and so forth. But culturally, it's a problem. It's considered to be not real. So what we're going to be doing in this series is really looking at the issues and some of the solutions and getting sort of a historical and philosophical perspective on it. Now, when I say those words, historical and philosophical, I want you to relax because it's going to be easy. It's going to be conversational. It's going to be something to give you background so that when you come up against those questions, it's going to come back to you, and you're going to go, oh yeah, right, but that's so and so, even if you don't have all the details. It's like to just shift so that you have the felt sense of the container that makes transformational work real, as something that is not just a story we make up to make ourselves feel better about the fact that the world is made of meaningless particles in rule-following patterns. So that's the purpose of the seminar. And people who come for transformational work come because they want to be treated as an intelligent, living, sensitive, responsive process. They want to be treated as if they were alive. Gosh, what a demand. They don't want to be treated as some kind of a mechanical system where you just diagnose it, you find the part that's damaged, and you either fix it or replace it. Because that's not healing. It's not healing to be treated in that way. Because we all have like an intuitive sense that we're more like a natural process than we are like a mechanical one. We're more like a jungle or a rainforest than we are like a hairdryer. Or even a computer. So, healing is, yes, there's a repairing of structure, but it's also that process of re-inspiring aliveness, of acknowledging people's aliveness and bringing it back out so that their aliveness feels acknowledged and their aliveness responds, that there is something inside of them that responds. And that's what stimulates the healing. That's what makes the shift. Right? Structural repair is definitely necessary, but there's a spark that triggers the structural repair. Whether it's biological or psychological, there's something that has to kick off. It's like the story of the kids in the orphanages who were never touched and who just would languish and die because their aliveness was never cultivated. There was nobody who connected with their aliveness and said, I see you, I get it, I honor you, I love you. They didn't have that, and they died. They had all, they had food, they had shelter, all the extraneous things for living, but they didn't have that spark that engaged their aliveness. So how do we talk about that in a way that makes sense in a scientific culture? So, transformation is essentially demoted to a fancy name for ordinary mechanistic processes. There was a conference down here in San Francisco a couple of months ago, and somebody who was here from out of town, who was going to the conference, called us up and said, hey, you guys want to go? And I looked at the website, and what the website was neuroscience people, which is great. Neuroscience is a wonderful thing. Essentially, if you read through the blurbs, they were essentially saying, okay guys, I know you're a bunch of hippy-dippy people out here and you believe in all these mythical thinking things, but we're going to tell you what's really happening. Because underneath those little stories that you have, there are mechanical neuroscientific processes that explain why you have those stories. And this was a conference supposedly about sort of transformational work. And here you had people explaining it away. It's not transformational work explained, it's transformational work explained away. It's considered to be just a good story and not scientific. So how do we get past that? Is that all there is? One of the key ways in is that when somebody says something is not scientifically real, the minute you get that word real in there, you go, wait a minute, but reality is always defined by some culture. And so if we're saying something is not scientifically real, we're saying it doesn't fit with the way of thinking in a particular culture that does science. That's it. Now, we've been pretty successful technologically with science, and it somehow gives us the idea that we got it right. That if we have cars and fighter jets and televisions, we must have it right. And the thing is that there are lots of other realities. There are lots of other cultures and lots of other ways of defining reality. We don't have a corner on the market. As a matter of fact, we are in many ways in the minority. If you look at over time and over the variety of human cultures, we are greatly in the minority. We're kind of pushing everybody around and trying to tell them that we got it right, but every culture does that. We used to call it empire, now we just call it capitalism and freedom. The the phrase not scientifically real really just means not real according to Western culture. So if we're going to talk about transformational work, it's really important to get how we got here. How did Western culture get to this idea of reality? Because if we understand kind of the historical background and how the process got here, then when the objections come to transformational work, you can recognize them and go, oh, right, that's that way of thinking. Okay? That's not truth. It's just it was a cultural decision at some point. It made sense at some point. But it doesn't have any absolute reality. Because if you're looking at the way reality is here, you get two choices. You get science, which is that the world is made up of these little mechanical things, little particles. Or you get social construction, which is reality is made up by stories that we tell ourselves. That's pretty much it. And of course, if you can take one of those, you can say, well, science is really a story that we tell ourselves. Or you can say that social construction is really an activity of organisms that are made up of particles. But either way, you don't get to any substance. Because if it's just a story that we make up, then it doesn't connect with our lives. It's kind of like, something we do to self-soothe. Not something that is actually coming out of how the world is, even if it isn't perfect. It's just not about how things are. It's about how we would like them to be. It's about what we want to say to make ourselves feel better. Or it's about particles that follow rules. And the things that we want to believe about it are just our version of things that don't have any meaning in themselves. What we're going to be looking at is transpersonal studies really comes out of transpersonal psychology, which has been around for about 45 years and has spent a lot of time trying to solve exactly this kind of problem. Has gone down a number of dead-end roads and has really come out with some new ideas and some new ways of framing things that, in my estimation, work pretty well. Actually don't evoke magical thinking, actually deal with a very much here and now kind of world, but deal with it in a way where transformation makes sense. Where transformation is not just some anomaly or some story that we put over things, but is actually the way things are. Is actually the nature of the world. So in terms of the learning process here, I'm going to invite you to have to learn in a particular way. And the first part of that, I already told you, which is just relax. Have no ambition to gather facts. You can take notes if it feels good, but let it go in terms of, I have to come away and remember something. I'm going to invite you to listen to the process, to the discussion, to the presentation part of it. Listen from your belly. That is, let the words into your whole body. Forget about trying to rethink them in your mind. If you're having them come in and go, oh yeah, okay, well let me remember that. Oh, what was that? Just let it go. Give it up. Let the words come into your body. And pretend that everything you hear, you already know. The point of that is, if you're in a conversation with people that you know, and it's a subject that you know, you completely relax. There's no effort. There's no trying. So I invite you to assume that you already know. Just be in the stance of, oh yeah, I know this. And if you don't know it, pretend that you do. Because it'll put you in a place where it's easier to take it in. At the same time, as you let it into your body, follow your curiosity. If something piques your interest, go with that. If something kind of raises a question for you, go with that. Raise the question. This can be dialogue, it's not just anything else. It doesn't need to, this is not a one-way process. So if something comes up, you go, oh, I don't think that's true. Great. Tell me. Speak your questions into the room. Because it's by following that little spark of what interests you and where your questions are that you're going to get something. Because that enables you to follow that spark of aliveness in you. So, why should you listen with your belly? Think about how you learned to drive. First time you got in the car, looked at all the controls. I remember the first time I got in a car and started driving, and it was like a gauntlet. It was like it felt like there were so many things happening. I had to watch so many things. I had to watch for pedestrians, I had to watch for cars, and there's those parked cars over there, and there's the steering wheel, and there's the gas, and there's the brake, and there's the clutch, and there's all this stuff going on. And then there's somebody telling me what to do, and I have to turn left and I turn right. It's just like overwhelm. Anybody have that experience when you started driving?
Oh, yeah.
Not you, Samantha.
No, I think I learned differently from other people.
Okay. Right. Do you ever have something where you're learning something new and it just feels like overwhelming because there's so much information?
That, yeah, just
Okay.
not driving.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. You're just a natural driver. So. But it's that experience. A lot of people have that experience. It's just a lot of information. Then, after you've been driving for a few years, it's like you can end up 2 miles past your exit and you don't even notice it because it's so automatic. In psychology it's called automatization. And that's a process of bringing the information out of the head and down into the body. Because when you're driving and you're just totally relaxed, you're driving from here. The part of you that sits down here is doing the driving. If you want to think too, you can. You can be off doing whatever you want to do. Because this part, it's got it. That's what mastery is. Mastery is when you know it from here. My mother tells a story of one of her teachers who said, it was her Latin teacher who said, I want you to know this so well that I can wake you up in the middle of the night, you can get out of bed, stand on one foot and recite it. Well, that kind of knowing involves something other than here. It involves that it's in your body. So that even if you're woken up in the middle of the night standing on one leg, things that would distract your cognitive mind, you can still speak it because it's in your body. So the idea of listening with your belly or with your body is, if it's got to end up here for you to master it, you might as well start here. Why run it through here? Why not just take it straight in? Save the trouble. What I find is that if I am thinking about what I'm trying to learn, it takes me much longer to retain it. If I am not thinking about what I'm trying to learn and just letting it in here, then when I'm in a situation where I need it, it just comes up. I'll give you an example. when I first one of my first articles that I published after doing my PhD was on transpersonal psychology, and for it I had to scan like 15 volumes of the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. I had to scan every article all the way through, looking for certain concepts. And so of course I wasn't trying to remember anything, because I wasn't even trying to learn anything. I was just trying to look for certain kinds of ideas and certain kinds of words. But what I found was, after that process, when I was just scanning for something else, all of a sudden I knew a whole lot of things about the field that I hadn't really been intending to learn. So I invite you to take this in that way. It's much easier and it's much more effective. So the learning from the head, you basically have to think about every individual thing. And while you're thinking about every individual thing, you're missing all of the other things. If you're learning from the body, the thinking doesn't get in the way of your learning. With the thinking out of the way, you're able to actually attend to what's going on. Does that make sense? Does that sound wrong to anybody? It's certainly counter to the way we're taught in school.
It seems a little impossible to me.
What?
To skip this part, to get to this part. I mean, I'm going to give it a shot.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it seems hard.
we're not going to just tell you to do it and not tell you how. So we're gonna invite you to just do a little process now. So when you're ready, just take one finger, touch it lightly to the center of your forehead. Take the finger away. And that little sensation stays after your finger is gone. Just imagine it's a little point of light. Imagine that as that little point of light sits there, you can move it, and you can allow it and welcome it as it rolls back and down into your head. It ends up in the middle of your head, behind your eyes, kind of behind the bridge of your nose. And then just be that point of light. Imagine that the sounds that you hear that are coming to your ears, that are passing right through your ears and arriving in at that center point in the middle of your head. Imagine that the sensations of your body are coming up and arriving at that center point. That if your eyes are open, or if they were open, that what you see will be arriving at that little point of light. That's you in the middle of your head. And as you sit here, imagine that you can just feel the silence inside your head. And that you can feel for those little things that pull you, those little stories, those little narratives, those little worries, sitting like clouds in and around your head. And as you breathe, imagine that you're just drawing them in. They're flowing in and dissolving in the center of your head. Now as that bright, focused light in the middle of your head let yourself drop down about 1 inch. So that where you are is not behind the bridge of your nose, but behind the tip of your nose, but right back in the center of your head. And if there's part of you in the middle of your head that's looking down and going, oh, yeah, there it is, then let go of that part. Let it float down. If there's part of you in your eyes watching, going, yeah, there I am, there it is, I'm down 1 inch. Let go of that part in your eyes and let it flow back and be part of that bright light in the middle of your head. Now imagine that you can just let yourself float down to the back of your throat. And then let yourself float down the back of your throat, through the neck, down into the upper chest, right along the front of the spine, back of the esophagus. Where you feel things, if you swallow something that's too big, you kind of feel it going down the middle of your body, right down to the level of the heart. As you arrive at the heart, imagine that the sounds no longer have to come to your ears. Imagine that the sounds are coming right to where you are, right here in the middle of your chest. Imagine that the sensations of your body arrive here. If your eyes are open, that the images come here, that what you see arrives at the center of the chest where you are. And if there's part of you up in your head watching, going, yep, I'm doing it right, let go of it. Let yourself be that light in the middle of your chest that is aware of itself. Be the point of light that is aware of itself. Feel for any feelings or worries or distractions that might be sitting in this area of your body. Use your breath. Bring them in. Just breathe them into that bright light in the middle of your chest. Let them dissolve there. Let them discharge into that bright light. When you're ready, just let yourself drift downward again along the front of the spine, down through the lower chest, down between the stomach and the spine, between the intestines and the spine, down to the low belly about 2 or 3 inches below the belly button, below the navel. Use your breath. Bring yourself to focus. And if there's any worries or concerns or troubling feelings or distractions here, just use your breath. Breathe them right in to the middle of the low belly. If there's part of you that's watching from your eyes, just let it go. Be the bright light in the middle of your belly that is aware of itself. Just relax the eyes, relax the eyeballs. Be the bright point of light. Calls to any attention that's still up in your eyes. Brings it down. imagine that this little point of light begins to grow up along the front of your spine as a line of light, right up the center of your body, right up the path that you came down through. Up between the spine and the intestines, between the spine and the stomach, up through the center of the chest, up through the neck, back of the throat, back into the center of the head. And as you arrive in the center of the head, rather than staying here, just relax and let yourself drop down and be the whole line. Be that whole line of light along the front of your spine. Be the line of light that receives the sounds, the smells, the sensations, the images. And feel the light in that line. And as you feel it, imagine that that light is radiating out. It's radiating out up the back of your body, the front of your body, the sides. It's filling your body and a little bit of the space around your body. And as you feel that radiance in and around your body, feel its warmth. Feel that it has just a little warmth to it. It has kind of a comfortable solidity. That your arms and legs are a little bit heavy and warm in a comfortable, relaxing way. And when you're ready, just allow your eyes to open and allow the information to come into your whole body. Allow it to come into that line. Be that line that just receives information from all around you. And notice if there's any thinking going on. Don't think about it. Just notice if there's any thinking going on. Just be the quiet light in the middle of the body and notice if there's any thinking going on. With any luck, there'll be a little less than there was when we started. So we're going to be talking about ideas and concepts and words. I'm going to invite you to stay in this quiet place. Just let the words in, rather than trying to think about them. Just let them in, because if you think about them, you can't hear them anymore. You're interrupting the process of receiving them. And as you receive them, watch for how your body feels in response to them. Does your body go, oh, that's interesting? Does your body go, yeah, but what about that? If it does that, share your question. Oh, you're missing something. Share your insight. Well, that doesn't make sense to me. Share your doubt. Go with what's real in the moment, how your body is responding. Okay, let's give it a shot. How's everybody feeling? Does work all right?
Relaxed.
Good. All right. So we're going to look at how we got at this notion of this Western notion of reality. So what happened this year, 1492? What happened? Everybody knows.
Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
That's right.
This continent didn't exist
No.
until he found
There
Of
you go.
course.
Right.
Well, we know that.
Nothing going on here.
Until, well, it's kind of like the way, you know, if there's a volcano that's just starting as a little smoking hole in the ground somewhere in the jungles of Central America, we get reports of volcanic activity, but they're not confirmed because it hasn't actually happened yet. Then we send a scientific team, and the scientific team confirms the reports. And that's what changes it from story to fact, is that you have scientists watching it. So, okay, so Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Yeah, so, did anything else happen that year? Yeah, you know.
Something else happened, but I don't know what it is.
Maybe something that would have a formative effect on the way our world is even up to the present moment. Did you learn some of that in your history books?
Yeah.
Oh.
No? All the billing goes to Columbus. I just want to make note here, okay? Have a group of very intelligent, literate, well-educated people who didn't learn this, okay? Because it's in the shadow of our culture. We like to pretend that it didn't happen.
Who was excommunicated?
No. Actually, it was a whole group of people who were excommunicated, if you will. So, on August 3, 1492, Columbus sailed from Palos de la Frontera, and you may remember the story that he had difficulty finding a crew,
Mm-hmm.
and he had difficulty finding ships, and his departure was delayed. Well, why would that be? Why would it be hard to find crew? And why would it be hard to find ships?
Because they were fighting somewhere.
Well, no, actually,
Wasn't the world still flat?
Yeah.
well, it was.
But there ought
But-
to be something
But
political.
I just want you to, I just want you to notice this moment, okay? I want you to notice the puzzlement. It's kind of like, yeah, you got the part of the story that Columbus left. You got the part of the story that he had a hard time finding ships. And you got the part of the story that it was difficult to find crew. But nobody told you why. And the reason was that on August 2, 1492, just one day earlier, that was the date that all Jews living in Spain had to leave on pain of death. 600,000 Jews, one of the largest forced movements of a population, had to leave by that date. So that is why all the ships were taken, and that's why it was hard to find crew members, because basically the first ethnic cleansing of the modern age was taking place. Now, how is it that that didn't make it into the history books? How is it that Columbus, with his 3 ships, is considered more important than the fact that in order to establish the nation state, the first nation state in the world of Spain, it was founded on ethnic cleansing. It was founded on the expulsion of a large part of the population that held the wealth and the culture of the nation. And in that is really the mechanics of the birth of Western reality.
Mm-hmm.
Because we went from interconnected whole to individual particles. We went from multicultural to monocultural. We went from multi-language to single language. All of that was right there in the birth of the first nation state of Europe. It's right there even if it isn't in history books, it's right there in Columbus's diary. In the same month in which their majesties issued the edict that all Jews should be driven out of the kingdom and its territories, in the same month they gave me the order to undertake with sufficient men my expedition of discovery to the Indies. Now that's a coincidence. Why would it be that it was in the same month?
Well, same day.
Yeah. Why would that be? Why that coincidence? And how come right up to the end, Columbus was still looking for ships and men? Now, Columbus was kind of a salesman. He went to Queen Isabella, tried to curry her favor for his little adventure. And, of course, the rub is always the money. How is it that the royals suddenly had money?
What was left behind?
How did they get enough money to finance a wild air expedition by some lunatic who thought that you could get to India by going west? Now that is a crazy idea in this world. How would they have money to do that? Well, the good news was that when these 600,000 Jews left, they weren't allowed to take anything with them except what they could carry. And they weren't allowed to take any silver or gold, which meant that they weren't allowed to take very much of their wealth. And there was a great deal of wealth. Guess where the money went? Ferdinand and Isabella. Oh, we have money now. Sure. Take your ships and go on your wild goose chase. We'll probably never see you again. Thank God, good riddance. That's where the money came from. The money to explore and colonize and oppress the native peoples of the New World came from ethnically cleansing the Old World.
So they could ethically cleanse the New World.
So they could ethnically cleanse the New World. Win-win.
But we can't forget about the Muslim populations.
Yes, absolutely. Their time was coming.
I don't know whether, you said speak our question, so my
Yes.
question is, are you suggesting that was the first time that there was ethnic cleansing of Jews?
No. But in terms of, there were certainly, the Romans certainly got the Jews out of a particular area.
Right.
Okay. But there was a way that a number of factors came together in the founding of the First Nation state that are very predictive of our world today.
I see.
So of the modern era, it was the first ethnic cleanse.
I see.
And of course, the earlier removal of Jews from Judea was by the Romans, from whom we claim our cultural heritage as well. Not that it didn't happen before. I mean, the Babylonians would take people out of their country. But in terms of the volume of people being taken out, it was a template for the world that we have now, I'd say, in a lot of ways. What you typically had in much of the pre-modern world was you'd have an empire that would go and conquer territories and would impose things on them and extract riches from them. But it was like, okay, that's still that country over there, but they submit to us. As opposed to saying, no, now that's us. We're going to get rid of people who are not like us, and we're going to get rid of languages that are not like us. The Roman occupation was like that. It was like, we're going to punish those people. We're going to punish those people because they defied us. It wasn't like, oh, this is now Rome, and we want to get rid of people because we only want Romans here. So it was a different kind of mindset. It was kind of like, we want homogeneity.
Mhm.
We want this contiguous, congruent, consistent nation state.
Mhm.
Different kind of future.
Mhm.
Rome wasn't like that.
And coincidentally, we also, we want the wealth that those exiled people are gonna leave behind. I mean,
Oh,
that
yeah.
that was a driving, the Jews held a lot of wealth.
Yes, they did, and a lot of the culture.
Uh-huh.
It was an incredible culture in Al-Andalus. So, and if you think back on your history lessons, you probably did hear the story of Ferdinand and Isabella kicking out the Arab invaders from North Africa.
The Moors.
The Moors,
Mhm.
exactly.
Mhm.
Those foreigners who'd come across from Africa and invaded Europe, and they just kicked them back out. Everybody remember that story? So in order to get some context on this whole process in Spain, we need to go back a few hundred years to the 7th century. I was informed by one of the Muslim students in my class that actually I shouldn't have a depiction of Muhammad because
Oh,
that's
right.
forbidden, but I do, so my apologies. Muhammad, the late 6th and early 7th century, essentially put together some of the tribal traditions and his own mystical experiences, and developed the Muslim religion and the early Muslim community, and his cousin Ali was the one who many of his followers felt should have been his successor. Now, what happened instead was, while Ali was preparing Muhammad's body for burial, the four of the companions had their own little conference on who should be Khalif, who should be the successor. And so one of them took it over instead, and then a second one, and then a third one. Of course, each one of them got killed not too far down the road. And then Ali was killed also. Ali, the people who felt that Ali should have been the successor of Muhammad became the Shia, and those who went with the secular leadership became the Sunni. Of course, we still have that problem today, big time.
Unbelievable.
And so out of the four companions and the Sunni line, you had finally, in the mid-7th century, the dynastic family of the Umayyads, who held control of the empire for about 100 years, and it was under their period that it reached its greatest extent. And what the empire looked like then was it reached from India to southern Europe. It actually extended into most of what later became Spain. Now, when they came to new territories like that, they didn't bring large amounts of settlers. They didn't move in. they did was they militarily conquered it, and then they said, well, you're under our rule now. If you convert to Islam, you will not have to pay tax. If you wish to retain your own religion, you are free to retain your own religion. All you need to do is pay an annual tax. So that was an incentive. Good, trickle-down incentive for people to convert to Islam, which many people did. So the Muslims who were in what later became Spain, in the southern part of Europe, were mostly the people who had been there for hundreds and thousands of years, who converted to Islam because it made economical sense. It allowed them to be the same religion and culture as the rulers, and it gave them a tax break.
I think it was a little more powerful than that.
Well,
It wasn't as benign as that, but
Go ahead.
I think there was more sword than and political, social necessity, as well as, economic. I can't go into detail, but that's my take on it.
Well, the sword was certainly there.
Yeah, I mean, it is a religion of conversion.
It is.
And they were very specifically going for that in their empire.
But relative to many of the empires that had, or many of the powers in the world, it was more tolerant. For example, I spent about 10 years archaeological excavation at the city of Caesarea Maritima. It's not much of a city now. It's a plowed fields inside of a kibbutz on the coast of Israel. But you had a large city there at one time. And when the Islamic forces came and surrounded it, it was essentially one of the last holdouts of Byzantine power. And people from inside the city, it was actually a Jew who betrayed the city to the Muslims, because there were many of the people who welcomed the Islamic invaders because they saw them as more tolerant and more sympathetic than the Byzantines. It's kind of like, okay, these people, okay, rulers are rulers, empires are empires, there's always some sort, but there's more tolerance, there's more allowance for diversity. So,
I agree.
nothing is perfect.
No, I mean, it's an interesting contrast that in the earlier tribal era, after Muhammad died, it was very much of a conquering kind of deal, but from tribe to tribe. But you're right. I mean, they established later on their culture was one of multiculturalism.
Right. And the Umayyads were remarkable in that not only did they have an amazing artistic and architectural tradition, this mosaic here that's coming up, you'll notice that it's flat. Okay, it doesn't have a depth dimension to it. Okay, that was a radical shift from the Greco-Roman styles. The Greco-Roman styles, the early Greco-Roman styles, it had so much perspective, it felt like you were walking over open space, like there was a hole in the floor. So there was this sense of perspective and image, and with the Umayyad, you had a shift to deliberate representationalism. Even though, of course, Muslim law forbids the production of images, of representational images, didn't stop them from doing it. But architecture, literature, medicine, government, relative religious tolerance, there was an appreciation for what other cultures brought. There was a desire to learn from other cultures. So, as empires go, it wasn't bad. If you were going to be in an empire, it was like, okay, well, let's be in that one instead of, which is one of the reasons it grew so quickly, because there were many people who welcomed it. So, the Umayyads carried this on for about 100 years, and were really great supporters of culture, of art, of poetry, of literature, of learning of all kinds. Their rule came to an end in the mid 8th century, around 750. What happened was that there was a very wealthy family, the House of Abbas, who were, of course, good friends with the rulers, and they invited all of the members of the ruling family to a great banquet at their palace. Then they closed the doors, locked them, and murdered them to a person, and took over the rulership of the empire, and moved the capital from Damascus back to Baghdad. They moved the capital from Damascus to Baghdad, and actually shifted the culture into a more Eastern culture, whereas it had been more outward-looking and more sort of drawing in. It's still very focused on learning and so on and so forth, but it shifted the culture of the empire quite radically. In that slaughter, there was one young prince who escaped, Abdul Rahman, and he made his mother was from North Africa, so he fled to North Africa. And he made his way along the North African, populations, and went across into the far reaches of the Islamic Empire in the Iberian Peninsula, what would become Spain, and there he revealed himself and declared himself, the heir of the House of Umayyad, and was welcome, and was far enough from the center of power that nobody was going to go chase after him. Am I missing anything you want to add? 'Cause all of this I actually learned from her, because she's the one who did the study of this area. That's right. So what you had was this Islamic conquest that came through and converted a lot of the people in what would later become Spain, and ruled there, kind of continuing that Umayyad tradition, that early appreciation of multiple cultures, support for arts, poetry, literature, medicine, all of that stuff, and continued there as the kingdom of Al-Andalus for 800 years. So this was not a bunch of Moors who came across from North Africa and were invading Spain. This was what the culture of the country had been for nearly 1,000 years.
It's nice.
It's nice.
Yeah, I've been there.
Oh,
So this really helps to fill in a
Yeah.
lot of holes.
so what was it like there?
It was like not Spain. It was like
Mhm.
stepping into a whole nother world and going to the places of worship that were mixed. It was like you could feel it. It was totally different and almost awe-inspiring.
Oh, what?
More awe-inspiring.
Oh,
It was like,
awe-inspiring.
it was, totally different energy, and I couldn't even figure it out that this was Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And it was beautiful. I mean, the art, the architecture was just amazing. But I just thought, oh, people from war came over, and I didn't know what the history was.
Right.
Well, it's interesting that over that 800 years, it was very dynamic. There were a lot of wars. There were a lot of
Mm-hmm.
the actual Al-Andalus was broken into provinces called taifas, and at one time or another, each one was at war with another, and there were invading armies from North Africa in different times within that 800 years period. But so there was a
Smaller
lot of-
skirmishes.
yeah, there was skirmishes, there were conquests, there was the Christians coming down from the north, trying to
Mhm.
take the provinces of the. So there was a lot of stuff going on, but basically what was holding was a culture that was very multicultural, and that was then as well bringing forward from the Middle East, from I've lost the name of the city again. From
Baghdad.
Baghdad,
Yeah.
you know, huge cultural assets that were totally lost in Europe at that time, you know, within what we call the Middle Ages, you know, in Europe. So it was a real center of learning and of poetry and of architecture and of music and
Medicine.
and medicine
Yeah.
and mathematics and I'm sure Glenn will get into this.
Well,
in
actually, that's
terms
the
of-
slide I'm on, so you're right
Ah,
in, right in line.
right. That whatever one's religion was, whether it were the Jewish population or the Muslim population or the Christian population, and there was a very viable Christian population there, that these people were all Arabized. They were not necessarily Middle Easterners or Arabs ethnically, but the culture was an Arab culture, the way we're all Americans, no matter, you know, what we're into. And so everyone spoke Arabic, you know, everyone dressed in Arabic-centric clothing. It was an Arabic culture. Christians were Arabized. The food, the quality of the poetry, the structure of the languages that they used were Arabized. But essentially, each population was able to maintain its own integrity within the cultural experience.
Well, not only maintain its integrity, but actually
But flourish.
develop its integrity,
Right.
because there was a revival of the Hebrew language during this period,
Right, exactly.
which had become a dead language, was only a written language, was no longer being spoken, and
Well, it was used in synagogue, but
Right.
it was not used as a
not as a
language.
a language of conversation.
Right.
And in Al-Andalus, it was revived as a spoken language. So there was that sort of room for cultivation of difference rather than homogenization.
And it was also where, you know, some of the great thinkers and spiritual leaders of all of the religions, you know, emerged during the Maimonides in Judaism, and, you know, Sufism was very much part of that cultural experience, and Kabbalah came out of that experience.
And it was the learning that came out of the Islamic Empire into Southern Europe. It was the learning that was in this culture here that began to seep into Europe, that basically created the Renaissance. Now, the normal story of the Renaissance is somehow we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps
Right.
and we got smart
Right.
and we just figured out a whole bunch of stuff. And that was the Renaissance. We
After
just
burning all the books.
we rebirthed ourselves. We became born again by ourselves.
Right. Right. Interesting.
And you had translation centers beginning like in the 10th century and especially into the 12th and 13th century. Translation centers that were translating first into Hebrew and then into European languages all of the scholarship of the Islamic Empire. So, our normal story of how we got to be us is you had Greece, you had Rome, you had the Middle Ages, and then you had the Renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Right.
And somehow, you know, Rome kind of decayed into the Middle Ages, and somehow there was this something that woke us back up. And that was the Renaissance. But, you know, and if you go by that story, then culture started back in, the Middle East, and then went to Greece, and then it went to Rome, and then it went to Europe. They just leave out kind of an important part, which is, it started back in the Middle East, did come to Greece, did come to Rome, but then the center of culture shifted back first to Damascus, and then to Baghdad, and then through the Islamic Empire up into the Iberian Peninsula, and then into Europe. That shadow still exists. Okay, first of all, nobody talks about the expulsion, first of the Jews, then of the Arabs, because there were several expulsion of Muslims after the Jews were kicked out of Spain. Nobody talks about the fact that the Renaissance came out of the learning of the Islamic Empire coming into Europe. Nobody talks about the fact that Western culture went through Damascus and Baghdad. We would rather have wars with them than acknowledge their place as part of our history.
I just wanted to add that when we mean Western culture, we're talking about Greek philosophy, for instance, Socrates and Aristotle and Plato and all of that philosophical background that was unknown to the intelligentsia, which were basically church leaders in Europe at that time. They were aware that something was there that existed, but they had no access to it other than through the Islamic culture, and that's what they were tapping into. So it was actually being translated. Aristotle, Plato, all of those guys were being translated, as Glenn said, through Baghdad.
Actually,
channeled into Andalusia to Toledo, which was the city of translation, where they had groups, as Glenn said, translating from Arabic to Latin, and the church intelligentsia, many of whom were coming out of the University of Paris at that time, would make their way down to Toledo and study for a few months at a time, and began picking this material up and bringing it back into Europe.
and being stars.
And being stars.
So they were, but it was the Christian world that wrote out, just deleted, right, this whole Arabic influence eventually. I mean,
Yeah,
that's what happened. Is
still doing it.
right.
Yeah, well, you're right on cue. There's actually an Nestorian Christians in Persia and Syria that translated those manuscripts, and because there was an interest in the Islamic Empire, there was a cultural interest in all kinds of information, and so that there was a period where rationalism was popular. They kind of moved past it and went more into mystical thought, which is how kind of like where the Islamic Empire shifted away from the path that European culture took. But it became part of that whole mix of literature that made its way into Europe. There were some Islamic philosophers. There was Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, and they were certainly familiar with the Greek philosophers and had their own contributions to philosophical thought. And then, in the 13th century, something rather remarkable happened. There was a mystical awakening that stretched from India to Europe. And if you look at many of the mystical figures, whether it's in Sufism or the troubadours or Kabbalah or the tradition of courtly love or the story of Radha and Krishna, all of these happened in the 13th century. what they had in common was the equation of relationship with God to the romantic relationship. So Radha and Krishna, story of Radha and Krishna, the two divine beings who had a romantic relationship, asked this representation of divinity. This was radically new in Hindu religion. The romantic poetry of Rumi, the songs of the troubadours, the knights and tournaments and courtly love and doing this for the lady and all that. All of this, and in those cases, it was you were striving for the beloved whom you could never attain, but it was a reflection of the spiritual journey. It was a spiritual quest. It was a romanticized spiritual quest.
Now, when was the first crusade? Was that in the 13th century?
No, that was in the 11th century.
I also see kind of the seeds of modern psychology in here as well. The yearning for the male and female parts of ourselves,
Something.
that search.
You must be in one of those fringe psychologies that doesn't talk about chemicals and behavior.
I'm getting there. No.
So, but say more about that. You're talking about sort of a Jungian.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That, from the Western perspective, the legends of courtly love. From a Western perspective, I always thought of as, there were knights and there were damsels in distress.
Mm-hmm.
But from this perspective, I can see it as a symbol or metaphor for the search for the complete self.
Well, and Jungian psychology really draws much more on this world. I mean, the wisdom of the great Eastern centers did a lot to inform alchemy, and Jung eventually turned to alchemy as the source of information for his psychology.
Mm-hmm.
He was essentially trying to use psychology as an avenue for alchemical transformation.
I would add the word, when we're talking about romanticized spirituality, I would add the word devotional.
Mm-hmm.
That it was through it wasn't even romanticized love, but it was sort of a meeting of romanticized love with devotional love, that one could reach a relationship with God through the love of the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's, that's basically Sufism.
It is.
You know.
It is. And it's also King Arthur.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And
You know,
right, and it translated
The
right
split
in.
and
Yeah.
Right. And the whole troubadour tradition, which propagated, the troubadours, as you know, were European musicians who went from town to town and sang stories or told stories of love and passion and war and love and passion. And that was also the cultural push, toward the idea of devotional, romanticized love. The stories of the knights and, all of that. And the culture of Mary. That's another piece that was very,
of
very...
Mary's.
Mary,
Uh-huh.
yeah. Wasn't that also a strong piece at that time, or did that come later or sooner?
I don't know that much about that one.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it was you had devotion to God, sort of co-mingled with sexuality in a radically new way. So this is all part of the shifting that is happening in preparation for this move into nation state. This was one of the cultural forces. Of course, when it came to Europe, was seen as rather threatening, and a lot of these were seen as rather threatening by the church, because they were stirring up the church and the nobles pretty much they had their thing in Europe. It's like it was working, everything was in order, and this learning that was coming out of Spain, this new information and knowledge, these philosophers, this mystical awakening, all this stuff was stirring the pot. Now, while this was happening in Europe, the Islamic Empire took a different turn. One of the reasons that Europe has forgotten, other than it wants to forget, Europe and the West has forgotten, is because the Islamic world took a very different turn. In the 11th century, Al-Ghazali was a mystic, basically used mysticism as a call for reform, because the empire had become very corrupt, and he spoke with a mystical voice against the corruption. And as a culture, the Islamic population turned away from rationality, turned away from science, turned towards the mystical, the religious. Of course, it has nothing to do with the world today. No people want to put in Islamic law anywhere. But when you hear that, when you hear people talking about wanting to impose Sharia law, when you hear about the Islamists, they are carrying on this tradition that started in the 11th century of turning away from corruption and to a path of religious righteousness. And that's still the conflict within Muslim society. Do we go for a secular and inclusive approach? Do we go for a more narrow religious kind of thing? So all of these things have been around for quite a long time.
So how does a mysticism turn into Sharia law?
Yeah, I was also thinking.
You know, people do that. I think that's what we do.
It's true.
Whatever it is, it's like, well, but what about this? Oh, well, we have to have a discussion. Oh, now we have to write it down. Oh, now we have to make some rules about that.
Yeah, the same thing happened with Hasidism. Hasidism was
exactly.
started by this wonderful hippie guy who was in Poland in the 17th century, who told people, study Torah, but it's joy and love, and that's how you communicate with God. Go into the woods, daven in the woods. You don't even have to go to forget the law. That was how Hasidism started, and look how rigid it's become today. I mean, it just turned it again into such strict belief systems that it just rigidified everything. Right?
When you have joy, you must do it this way. 2 steps to the left, 1 step to the right.
Well,
Then
even
you
the,
say this prayer.
Right, and wear the same clothing they did 340
That's
years
right.
ago.
yeah, but even like the American conservative right has gone to this extreme Tea Party thing
Mhm.
that makes up stuff. So
If they wore tricornered hats in 1770s, then we should wear tricornered hats now.
but they don't even know the history. They just kind of, it's all revision. They make stuff up that
Mhm.
suits them.
Sure.
So people do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here we go again.
So, sort of the last gasp of Islamic philosophy was Ibn Rushd, who in the 12th century tried to stop the shift towards conservatism and argued that there were 2 paths to God. There was the path of religion and there was a path of philosophy, that you could get to the same truth either way. Now, when that idea came to Europe, that was very appealing to some people. because, wow, if there's a path to God that doesn't involve the church and the power structure, how cool would that be? The church took a little dimmer view of it. Ibn Rushd, who was called Averroes in Europe, inspired the Averroists, who were considered heretics. And it was against some of these groups that were bringing in new ideas that the First Inquisition was launched. And then you had also the First Crusade. We're having social unrest. Let's have a war with the Middle East. Seems like a good idea. And of course, this was on, supposedly on religious grounds, but in a lot of ways, it was. You can only imagine that it must have been a striking back at the source of all this cultural disruption, because the established powers in Europe were being destabilized by the intellectual and mystical ideas that were coming in from the East through the Iberian Peninsula and through these translation centers and through the cultural movements and troubadours and all this stuff. It was very destabilizing. It was like, well, let's attack them. So in the 12th century, earlier, you may remember from the earlier map that Al-Andalus took most of the Iberian Peninsula. By the 12th century, there wasn't all that much. It was less than half of the peninsula that was left. And by 1492, in the 15th century, Al-Andalus was a tiny little strip down at the bottom. Now, what happened was that, as Michaela was saying, there was these different taifas, these different city-states. Some of them were Christian, predominantly Christian, some were predominantly Muslim, and they vied for power and power and control switched hands. By 1492, the Christians held all of the territory, all the taifas except one, and that was Granada, of course. And Granada was the last holdout. And so the tradition was that when a taifa was conquered by another taifa, that people would be allowed to maintain their same religion. It was just kind of like the rulership changed places, but nothing big happened culturally. So when Ferdinand and Isabella offered those kinds of terms, it would have been very familiar. It's like, okay, yeah, here it goes again. Okay, yeah, you're going to get to keep your religion. Everything's going to be cool. Just let us in. Because if you don't let us in, we're going to stay here and then we're going to kick your ass. So just let us in and everything will be cool. Well, the city of Granada surrendered, and almost immediately, Ferdinand and Isabella moved to outlaw anything but the Christian religion, and very quickly put in the Edict of Expulsion to kick out first the Jews, and then later, 1390, what is it? Well, there was, even before that, there had been some pogroms against the Jews, and after that, you had the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition started against those Jews who had converted under the suspicion that they might not really have converted. And then you also had expulsions of the Muslims, several expulsions of the Muslims. So you had basically a consistent process of trying to eliminate Muslims and Christians and their culture and their religion from the entire peninsula. Want to add anything? So, when they were done, they pronounced it the Kingdom of Spain. This was the formation of Spain, and it was the first nation state in Europe. And they developed a national language. Spanish was now to be the language, because what you had before that is you had, most places people spoke 2 or 3 different languages, and from one region to another you kind of blended from one language to another. Here people spoke a little more of that, here they spoke a little more of this, and as you traveled, it was like a spectrum, like a rainbow spectrum, where it just kind of changes gradually from one color to another. Spain put in boundaries and said, here are the borders, in these borders you will speak Spanish, and you will be Christian. And here is the national grammar. And if you're not like one of us, you get out. So this was not an expulsion of invaders. The conquest of the Moors, quote unquote, was not a conquest of invaders, it was a cultural expulsion. Because, as you already know by now, these people had been there for hundreds of years. Arabic had been the language and intellect of art, of culture, for hundreds of years.
Mathematics.
Architecture, medicine, everything. This was kicking out people whose people had been there for thousands of years, who had taken on the culture, a particular culture, and it was a cultural expulsion in order to create a consistent language and culture and nation state.
And very much backed and supported and pushed by the Pope. Isabel was very close to the Pope. I don't remember who it was at the time. But this was a scheme and a strategy that was put together between Rome and Isabel and Ferdinand. And Isabel was really the powerhouse, and Ferdinand, in terms of the family royal structure, she was the one who had the basic family behind the power base.
Right. And so you had this cultural homogenization. And out of that, they got the resources to start colonizing. So you have a lot of elements of what we love about European culture that all coalesced in this one that came to a head in 1492. So I find it remarkable that something so formative is so absent from our narrative.
What was going on in Northern Europe at the time? Just sort of a broad brushstroke.
More nation states. More
Well, it was,
princely states.
it was tribal.
Yeah, tribal.
It was still somewhat tribal. And gradually that process spread to the nation states.
It was feudal, but it was also tribal. Languages were very, as Glenn said, there were a lot of different languages. Remember, everything started with Latin, and look what it turned into. You had French, you had Spanish, they were all derivatives of Latin. But at that time,
you had tribal languages too.
right,
The
the
Franks and
Germanics,
the
the Germanic languages. But at that time, you had hundreds and hundreds of different languages and different cultures living side by side in Europe. There were very soft, permeable delineation between one area and the other. But of course, the church was the main political power.
Right. So fairly quickly after the nation state of Spain, fairly quickly that spread throughout Europe?
Well, it took several hundred years. Germany didn't become nation state until the 1800s.
It's sort of
Well,
like
you
the
had a lot of
Renaissance.
empires, you had Austria.
Can't forget the Danish Empire.
Right. Now, from a different point of view, from the point of view of someone living in the Middle East or in Turkey or Western Asia or North Africa, the exile of Jews and Arabs from the Iberian Peninsula had a huge impact on their cultural
Yes, it did.
experience. because suddenly you had 500,000 people or so. I mean, there were a lot of people that, you know, maybe moved to, there was a great exile, or emigration from the Iberian Peninsula of Jews who we now call Sephardic Jews up to Holland. Many of them, after the New World opened up, got on board boats and said, hey, I'm hitting the New World and getting away from the Inquisition. So, you know, you have a lot of Jewish communities in the Caribbean in the 17th century and in Latin America just trying to, you know, find a safe place, which didn't really happen because the Inquisition followed them. But you had a huge amount of population from Andalusia going to North Africa and going back into the Ottoman Empire at that time was very strong and happy to welcome these very educated, very savvy, you know, homeless people, and really give them a base of operation in their empire, knowing that they were going to contribute well to the economy. So that had impact in terms of whatever their culture was at the time.
So it's a little bit oversimplification to put all these things on 1492, but it kind of works. And it's what I like to call the birth of the particle age. And this is where we got our, you know, this is kind of the birth of the Western idea that the world is made out of objects, and that humans should be considered in terms of individuals, because these were not self-evident prior to all of these shifting forces that created European culture. Humans were, and in some parts of the world still are, sort of more considered at the level of family and of community than they are at the level of individual. But with Christianity being a proselytizing religion about the salvation of the soul, you could have somebody who was converting and who was the only one in their family, and so their soul would be saved and their family would not. So even in 4th, 5th centuries, you get the beginning of the idea of individual personality within Christian theology and Christian thought that contributed to this shift from family and community to focus on the individual. And for us, it's like, well, you know, what is the unit of humanity? Well, it's individuals. It's just self-evident. Psychology says, well, we study the psychology of individuals. Occasionally you have these radical people that think things are connected, but mostly it's like, well, what is, you know, well, here's the person and here's their brain and here's the processes in that brain that lead to the individual personality. And that's considered normal.
Those other people just haven't self-actualized yet.
And even self-actualization, that's just a story.
Yeah.
And it wasn't either clear that the world was just made of objects, because there were all kinds of living forces that penetrated the world and still do in a lot of cultures. But for the West, the world became objectified. So I'd like to see that shift into, here is the particle of a nation state, as congruent with this movement into a particle world. Some of the things that came with that were that living things are particle-based machines. Machine and particle and object, these were the cutting-edge ideas of the time because they enabled people to do things that they could not do before. Especially in Europe, where you had authority as the only source of knowledge. Authority as the only source of knowledge. If you wanted to find out something about religion, you went to someone in the church. If you wanted to find out something about, you know, law, you went to the nobles who ran the justice system. If you wanted to find something out about, you know, trade or work, you apprenticed yourself. You always put yourself in a subservient position to authority, and that is how knowledge was obtained, because knowledge was seen to be held by authority. Knowledge was not something you went out and got for yourself. You went to the source and you received it from the source.
A
If-
model that contemporary education is still based on.
That's right.
Contemporary
And that's
culture
why,
depends
that's why
on.
we failed so
Yeah.
desperately.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And the other idea, of course, is that appropriate union, the unit of society is the nation state. So living things are particle-based machines. Objects are made of particles. If they're living objects, they're machines. You got this whole system, which was new. And there are many resonances between this early formative period and today. You had large-scale mystical awakening, you had the rise of militant religious extremism, you had East-West cultural exchange, East-West political tension. In the 13th, 14th century, you also had a big movement of women rising to prominence, the Cathars, things like that. So there's a lot of resonances between that period and now. And so when you come to René Descartes, when you have all of this background, you can see what a genius this guy was in terms of the politics of his day. Because you had a church that had this authoritarian structure, and then you had these new impulses of information coming in that were destabilizing things, and the church being very adamantly against them and trying to suppress them. Okay, but they were coming relentlessly anyway. And so what Descartes did was he drew a line between mind and body. And he said, body has extension in space. It's here in the physical world, size, shape, location, all that stuff. But it has no intelligence. Mind is not here. It's not in space. It doesn't exist in space. But it has intelligence. So what that allowed was for the process of people involved in these new scientific ideas that were coming from the Islamic world. Europe did not invent science. The Islamic world did. These ideas that were coming in to continue, and the church to have its own domain. It's like, okay, well, we're just finding about the laws, about the things that God created. We're just discovering, we're just exploring what it is that God created and how it is that it works. But you, the authority, you will tell us about mind and soul and spirit and all that sort of thing. That's your domain. But your story is telling us about the world that God created. We're just exploring it. All to God's glory. And of course, this was not very long after the papal condemnation of Galileo, whose ideas about the Earth being at the center, not being at the center of the universe, came from an Islamic astronomer about 100 years earlier. His drawings of the evidence for heliocentrism are very, very similar to those of an Islamic astronomer who preceded him by a century. He was one of those guys that, as Michaela was saying, went down to Toledo to these translation centers, found some cool ideas, brought them back to Europe, and was, wow, amazing, fantastic discoveries, what a guy. Except, of course, the church didn't like that. But see, as long as the church was still in the realm, in the business of saying how the physical world was, then all this new knowledge had to be suppressed. So, as this, this information wasn't going to stop, but Descartes' idea of making that split in reality between mind and body, between mind and matter, essentially allowed, it was a political compromise in the context of the processes that were happening in culture at that time. It was a way to make peace and allow this new information to come into Europe without the church losing its authority. So it was brilliant. And because it allowed science to have one domain and religion to have another domain. So, there's a lot of interest in, well, what is the relationship between science and religion? Well, why is there that split? Well, why can't we heal that split? Well, we can't heal that split the way it is. As long as you hold on to this assumption that the world is divided into mind and matter, as long as you hold that assumption, you can never heal that split, because that split was designed to keep them apart. It is in the structure of our culture and our assumptions. So Descartes came up with this dualistic idea, and the mind and body are two distinct realms, different kinds of reality. He thought maybe they overlapped in the pineal realm, but out of that we have a science where the mind of the observer is different than what is being observed, is in a wholly different order of reality. Okay? So you have the subject-object split. And as long as you have the subject-object split, you're going to have the science-religion split. You're going to have all of these things that seem mysterious because we've designed it that way. We've designed it to be obscure, so that people who were in the medieval period could be at peace. See, but we don't really need that anymore. Okay, but I just want to look here at what it means to have this subject-object split. What it means is that you have a world that is divided into meaningful objects and meaningless non-objects. You have reality and you have distortion. So on the one hand, in meaningful objects, you got brain, you got chemicals, you got matter, you got physics, you got things, you got the natural physical world, all of the outer stuff. That's real. Then you've got mind, emotion, thought, intelligence, subjects, spiritual dimensions. All of that is distortion. All of that is meaningless. All of that is not real. And essentially, what a psychology or some other scientific process does is tries to say, okay, let's take these made-up things over here, these things that aren't real, and let's correlate them to something that is real. This mind thing, well, we don't know what that is. We can't measure that, so it's not real. But we can measure the brain, so let's just say that the mind is the brain. And then we'll work with that. So then you get to things like meaning or transformation. And you look and see, well, what is there in objective reality? And there isn't anything. And so we decide it's not real. And transformative work lives under that cloud. That it's really just one of those things over on the meaningless non-object side that's not real. And that what we need to do is really just stay with the things that are over with objective reality. And what we've done is taken the religion part, that's kind of, in terms of cultural reality, that's kind of faded out. And we've taken the mind that used to be part of that spiritual domain, and we've kind of tacked it on to the scientific side. That's what psychology is. It's like, oh, well, let's we can't get rid of that mind thing. So we'll just kind of tack it onto the objects. We don't really kind of get how it fits, but we'll just study the objects and pretend that that's the same thing. But transformation has to do with things that aren't just, that you can't understand transformation if you have made that kind of split. It doesn't make any sense. So, because you're essentially saying that transformational work is not real. Mechanical work is real. Things that work on the objects, the structure, that's what's real. So, we're going to be looking in the coming sessions at both a little more of this process and also something entirely new in terms of a different way. It isn't just stuck between this scientific mechanism and social construction, but actually a different and more productive way of putting it all together.
Well done.
Wow.
Hmm.
Beautiful.
So feel free, and if there's any questions or more discussion, feel free.